June 3rd, 2009, 2:17 in the afternoon. Bertrand's Music and Memorabilia, 114 Cahuenga Boulevard, Hollywood, California. Son. The word came out flat, final, like a door being shut. Put your hands in your pockets. Walter Bertrand was 68 years old, and in 38 years behind that counter, he had never once second-guessed himself. He wasn't second-guessing himself now. The boy standing on the other side of the glass case was maybe 14, maybe younger. Worn sneakers with the left sole beginning to separate. A Guns N' Roses t-shirt, faded from too many washes, the logo cracked across the chest. Fingertips callous in a way that told you the kid had been playing guitar since before his hands were big enough to make a full chord. And his eyes, locked on the open case in front of him, like he was looking at something sacred. Walter reached across the counter and clicked the guitar case shut. The 1959 Gibson Les Paul Standard, sunburst finish, Brazilian rosewood fretboard. Every curve of that guitar was worth the $18,500 printed on the tag inside the red velvet lining. It was not a guitar for boys in cracked sneakers. "This isn't a toy store," Walter said, already turning back toward his register. "That instrument costs more than your father makes in 4 months. You understand me?" The boy didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look away from the closed case. The shop went quiet. 3 customers froze mid-browse. A teenage girl near the vinyl racks gripped a record sleeve and looked at the floor. Nobody said a word. And then the door chime rang. The man who walked through that door had spent 30 years playing guitars worth 10 times that price. And he had heard every single word. The teenage girl, near the vinyl racks, Maya, 16 years old, daughter of a studio engineer from Burbank, had been reaching for a copy of Appetite for Destruction when Walter's words landed. Her hands stopped mid-air. She looked at the boy, then at Walter, then back at the boy. The expression on her face was something between anger and recognition. The look of someone who had been on the receiving end of a door shut in their face and knew exactly what it sounded like. The older customer near the back, a collector in a pressed linen shirt, easily worth 6 figures by the watch on his wrist, pretended to study a framed Clapton photograph. He had heard. He simply chose to keep his eyes on the wall. Pete, Walter's 24-year-old shop assistant, stood behind the secondary register and stared at a point somewhere between the floor and the ceiling. He had worked at Bertrand's for 2 years. He had seen this before. He had learned not to say anything. The boy reached into the back pocket of his jeans. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, notebook paper, the cheap wide-ruled kind, creased into quarters, and set it on the glass counter without a word. His hand was steady. His jaw was tight. Walter glanced down. It was a handwritten chord diagram, 8 bars of something, pencil marks, notations in the margins, a composition. Not copied, original. Walter pushed it back across the counter without picking it up. "I sell instruments," he said, "not dreams." The boy folded the paper, put it back in his pocket, and did not leave. To understand why he stayed, why that paper existed, why those fingers were callous the way they were, why a 14-year-old boy had walked 2 bus routes across the San Fernando Valley to stand in front of a guitar he had no intention of buying, you have to go back 11 years. Back to a small house on Maple Street in Van Nuys, California. Back to a Sunday evening in 1998. And back to a father who came home carrying a broken guitar and a promise he intended to keep. Robert Reeves was not a famous man. He was never going to be a famous man, and somewhere around his 32nd birthday, he had made his peace with that. He had come to Los Angeles at 19 with a duffel bag and a 1974 Gibson SG with a cracked headstock that he had bought for $60 from a pawn shop in Fresno. He had believed, the way only 19-year-olds can believe, that the city would hear him playing and simply open its doors. The city did not open its doors. He spent 4 years doing session work, Background fills, demo recordings, late-night overdub sessions for producers who never learned his last name. Then, the session work dried up, the way it always does for the men the industry uses but never keeps. He took a job driving freight out of a logistics yard in Chatsworth. He worked 6 days a week. He came home on Sunday, smelling of diesel and road dust, and he played guitar in the garage for 2 hours. And for those 2 hours, he was 19 years old again, and the city still had its doors wide open. Danny was born in 1995. Robert used to set him on his knee in the garage while he played. Even before the boy could sit up on his own, before he had words for anything, Robert would play and Danny would go completely still in a way he never went still otherwise, like the sound organized something inside him that nothing else could reach. Danny was 4 years old. The first Sunday, Robert played the opening riff of Sweet Child O' Mine on that cracked Gibson SG. The child reached up without hesitation and put 3 fingers on the strings, not randomly, in position. Robert looked at those small, callous-to-be fingers on the fretboard and said something he would say only once, in a voice so quiet it was almost to himself. Those hands were made for this. Don't let anybody tell you different. Robert Reeves died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March 2006. He was 41 years old. He left behind a 1974 Gibson SG with a cracked headstock, a box of session recordings nobody would ever release, and a 10-year-old boy who had already been playing guitar for 6 years. Danny taught himself everything after that. Library books, online tutorials, 4 hours every night after homework in the same garage on the same cracked SG. At 13, he won the Los Angeles Youth Music Competition. The prize was $200. He saved every cent for 14 months. He walked into Bertrand's Music and Memorabilia on June 3, 2009 with $340 in cash. Not to buy the guitar, just to hold it once. Just to feel what his father always said real wood felt like in your hands. He never got that chance. But the man now standing inside the doorway of that shop had a very different idea about what this afternoon was going to look like. Walter Bertrand had not looked up from his register when the door chime rang. He was logging a transaction. A 1962 Fender Stratocaster, consigned that morning by an estate lawyer in Pasadena. And he did not look up, because in 38 years behind that counter, he had developed an instinct for customers worth interrupting his work for, and the sound of one person entering quietly did not meet that threshold. Pete looked up, and Pete said nothing. He gripped the edge of the counter with both hands and stared at a point just past Walter's left shoulder and said absolutely nothing. Maya, near the vinyls, recognized him in approximately 5 seconds. She knew that silhouette. Every 16-year-old who had ever loved rock and roll knew that silhouette. The top hat, the curls spilling out underneath, the black leather jacket worn in June, like weather was a matter of personal opinion. She lowered the record sleeve she was holding, slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might break whatever was happening in this room. The man moved through the shop without touching anything. He passed the signed Hendrix photograph. He passed the case with the vintage Gretsch. He stopped when he reached the counter. He looked at the closed guitar case. He looked at Danny. He looked at Walter, still bent over his register, pen moving. And then Walter felt it, that particular quality of silence that means a room has changed while you weren't paying attention. He looked up. The man on the other side of his counter removed his sunglasses. Walter Bertrand's pen stopped moving. It was Saul Hudson, Slash, the man whose fingers had recorded the opening riff of Sweet Child O' Mine in a single take in 1987 in a studio on Sunset Boulevard. The most recognizable guitarist on the planet, standing inside Bertrand's Music and Memorabilia on a Tuesday afternoon in June, like he had simply been in the neighborhood. He had been in the neighborhood. Grandmaster Recorders, 2 blocks north. His driver had pulled over because Slash had seen something in the window of Bertrand's and said stop. He had not said what he saw. He came in looking for nothing specific. He had found something very specific. Open the case, Slash said, quietly. No performance in it. 4 words spoken the way you speak when you are not asking. Walter opened his mouth. Mr. Hudson, the boy was just, I heard what the boy was. Slash set his own road case on the floor beside him. Open the case. Walter opened the case. Slash looked at Danny. Play it. Danny looked at the guitar, then at Slash. 3 seconds of silence that felt like a full minute. He lifted the 1959 Gibson Les Paul Standard out of the red velvet lining. His hands did not shake. He plugged into the 1965 Fender Twin Reverb standing against the wall. He found the pick on the counter. He positioned his fingers. He played his composition. 8 bars. The ones on the folded notebook paper. The ones Walter had pushed back across the counter without reading. The shop did not breathe. When Danny stopped, Slash stood completely still for a long moment. Then he turned to Walter Bertrand and said the 7 words that made the older customer near the Clapton photograph finally put down his pretense and simply listen. That boy just earned everything in this room. Walter Bertrand stood behind his counter and did not move. 7 words. That boy just earned everything in this room. And the man who said them was already reaching into his jacket, already pulling out a card. Matte black, no design. The kind of credit card that does not advertise itself, and setting it on the glass counter next to Danny's folded chord diagram like the 2 things belong together. Ring it up, Slash said. The Les Paul, the Twin Reverb, and whatever that kid has in his pockets. Give it back to him. Walter's hands moved before his mind caught up. He processed the transaction in silence. $18,500 for the guitar, $3,200 for the amplifier, $21,700 total. The machine beeped. The receipt printed. Walter's hands were trembling in a way that had nothing to do with age. Danny had not moved from the spot where he had played. The Les Paul was still in his hands. He was looking at it the way his father used to look at the cracked Gibson SG on Sunday evenings in the garage in Van Nuys, like it was the one object in the world that made complete sense. Slash crouched down to Danny's eye level. It was a deliberate thing, that crouch. A choice. He spoke quietly enough that only Danny could hear. Your dad played guitar. Danny looked up. How did you know? Because nobody plays like that at 14 unless somebody showed them something worth loving. A pause. What was his name? Slash nodded slowly. Robert Reeves taught his son to play guitar. He said it the way you say something you want a person to carry with them. That's worth knowing. He stood, picked up his road case, walked toward the door. He stopped, turned back to Walter. Not with anger. Something quieter than anger. Something that landed harder. Gene Bertrand let me hold a Les Paul in 1987. I was 22. Didn't have $1 in my pocket. He didn't ask what I could afford. A beat. He said, let me show you what your hands were made for. The door chime rang. Slash was gone. The shop held its silence for a long moment. Then Maya walked to the counter, set down the copy of Appetite for Destruction she had been holding since the beginning, paid for it without a word, left. Walter stood alone, the empty red velvet lining of the guitar case open on the counter in front of him, the shape of something that was no longer there. Walter Bertrand closed the shop 1 hour early that evening. He sat alone behind the counter for a long time after he turned the sign. The chord diagram was still on the glass in front of him. 8 bars, pencil on wide-ruled notebook paper. A 14-year-old boy's handwriting in the margins. He picked it up carefully, the way you pick up something you almost threw away and didn't, and he held it under the counter lamp for a full minute. The following Monday, he called a framer on Melrose Avenue. It cost him $240, to have it mounted and matted behind UV glass. He hung it on the wall of Bertrand's music and memorabilia, between the signed Hendrix photograph and a 1969 Woodstock poster. Below it, he placed a small brass plate engraved with 11 words: Danny Reeves, age 14, Cahuenga Boulevard, June 3, 2009. He changed one policy the same week. Any musician under the age of 18 could hold any instrument in the store. No purchase required, no questions asked. He named it the Gene Bertrand Rule, after his father, because his father had known something Walter had spent 19 years unlearning. By 2012, Danny Reeves was playing lead guitar in a band out of Burbank called The Hollow Road. By 2015, they had signed with Interscope Records. His debut album, released in 2016, carried a dedication on the inside sleeve. For Robert Reeves, Van Nuys, California. You were right about the fingers. Track 3 was an 8-bar instrumental. He called it Cahuenga. Music critics called it the most assured debut composition from a guitarist under 25 in recent memory. Not one of them knew where those 8 bars came from. Not one of them knew about the folded piece of notebook paper on a wall in Hollywood. Danny Reeves never forgot what Slash told him in that corner of the shop. Not the part about the guitar, not the part about the money, the part about his father. Robert Reeves taught his son to play guitar. That's worth knowing. He has said in every interview since, and there have been many interviews since, that those 11 words did something the $200 competition prize and the record deal and the critical reviews never quite managed to do. They made it real. They gave it a name. They put Robert Reeves from Van Nuys, California, permanently into a story that was always going to outlast the both of them. Walter Bertrand is still behind the counter at Bertrand's Music and Memorabilia on Cahuenga Boulevard. He is 73 years old now. The Gene Bertrand Rule is still in effect. Young musicians still walk through that door and hold instruments worth more than their parents make in a year. And Walter watches their faces, and he does not say a word about what things cost. He looks at their eyes instead, because that is what Slash did not say out loud, but said anyway, in the way he crouched down, in the way he spoke a dead man's name like it deserved to be spoken. The eyes tell you what the hands are capable of. The clothes tell you nothing at all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Share it with someone who was told they couldn't afford their dream. Because sometimes the most valuable thing in the room is the kid standing in front of it.